Starting with the formal introductions, tonight's first speaker is Hayyim Rothman. He did his undergraduate work in Judaic Studies and Psychology, later earning his MS in Education at Florida International University. He then attended Yeshiva University, earning his MA in Jewish Philosophy. He is currently a doctoral candidate in philosophy at Boston College. Hayyim's research interests include early modern philosophy, utopianism, structural Marxism, and Deleuze. He is currently most interested in the social production of space and the role of spatial configuration and spatial practice in affecting social and political change. His approach to the topic being intimately shaped by his reading of Spinoza. The title of his paper for this evening is Machiavelli and the Comic Republic. Also, quick note, speakers, there's water under the lectern for you.
Alternatively renowned and reviled for his theoretical innovations, Machiavelli is almost universally regarded as the father of modern political theory. To whatever extent this is or is not the case, a question I leave to others, it is granted that when the man is thought of, it is typically in his role as a historian and as a philosopher. It is therefore with some surprise that the reader is confronted with the following signature, with which Machiavelli closed a letter addressed to Francesco Giugardini in November of 1525. Quote, Niccolo Machiavelli, historian, comic writer, and tragic writer, unquote. In his own self-estimation, the master's identity as a comedian stands alongside that role, in light of which he is more conventionally seen. So far as a complete survey of Machiavelli's literary production is far beyond the scope of a short study such as the present one, I direct my attention to his masterpiece, La Mandrangola, the mandrake. So as to frame my particular interpretation, a brief survey of scholarly approaches to this text and more broadly to Machiavelli's other two comedies is necessary. The predominant hermeneutic stance, championed by Benedetto Croce and followed by many others, regards the text from the personal standpoint of the author, who during the period of its production was prevented from writing in an overtly political vein and therefore embodied his catalog of virtues and vices in narrative form. As Donald Beecher notes in his introduction to the play, the allegorical interpretation positions Machiavelli as a fundamentally serious writer. Moreover, as he goes on to say, it is only as strong as the mapping apparatus by which political ideas are superimposed onto the social patterns of the play. The alternative which Beecher seems to advocate and which is more explicitly taken up by readers as diverse as Leo Strauss and Antonio Negri regards Machiavelli's comic period, and with it La Mandrangola, as an abdication from his political interests, a retreat into civic life. Both positions, however, place the interpretive weight of Machiavelli's corpus on his explicitly theoretical work and question only how or whether it relates to his literary work. Angus Fletcher represents an interesting reversal of this trope and suggests in specific consideration of the relation of teaming between the Mandrangola and the prince, that instead of interpreting the former as an expression of the latter, it is the opposite which constitutes the appropriate hermeneutic tactic. By situating the master's work within the broader framework of Renaissance literature, Fletcher maintains that it is Machiavelli's interest in comedy that is to be taken as the shaping force, as a force which imbues his other work with a comic ethos. In the present study, I adopt a synthetic posture. I concur with Fletcher that comic ethos pervades Machiavelli's work and therefore reject the interpretation, the interpretive trajectory presumed by proponents and opponents of the allegorical method. I disagree, however, that demonstrating a pervasive comic ethos means a simple reversal of directionality. It is my view that examining the topic of comic ethos will begin with an examination of the mechanism governing the comic effect of Machiavelli's play. The comic in this sense is regarded symptomatically as the outcome of a function which produces other sorts of symptoms when integrated into different ideoproductive ensembles, political theory for instance. To illustrate this point, I narrow my interpretive focus to a feature of La Mandrangola which has been inexplicably neglected, namely its title. Many studies have sought to shed light on the esoteric significance of its characters, Calimico, Nicia, Ligurio, Lucrezia, and so on. But what of Mandrake? If the characters are as fundamental to the work as these studies suggest, why was the play not, like Machiavelli's other dramas, Clizia and Andria, named after one of them? I believe this is because it is the mandrake root which, as it were, constitutes the true protagonist of the work, which takes center stage. Having elaborated on the character of the mandrake and its functional role in La Mandrangola, I proceed to examine the relation of this function first to the comic in its particular form as humor. At this point, I illustrate the ligature binding humor as a mode of the comic and the physiological theory of humors which dominated medical theory and practice until the dawn of modernity, and both with the particular and, in my mind, extremely useful construction of humor proposed by Deleuze. Then, on the basis of Anthony Perel's illuminating theory on the centrality of humoral medicine to Machiavelli's vision of statecraft, I argue that the master's political theory cannot be separated from his comedies so far as both operate on the basis of one and the same underlying functional structure, namely the magical and subterranean activity of the mandrake. Let us first consider the mandrake as a seat of medicinal and magical properties. In La Mandrangola itself, a variety of powers are attributed to the root. On the one hand, it is an elixir of life, making fertile the womb of she who ingests it. On the other hand, it is a poison said to cause the death of the first man to have relations with the woman who ingests it, or alternatively to cause miscarriage. Analysis of these properties and their function within the text is forthcoming. It must be noted first, however, that while Machiavelli indeed draws directly on two features traditionally associated with the mandrake, first, that of fertility is exemplified, for example, in the Hayyim of Scripture, and second, its empirical status as a poisonous substance, there is a third feature of which he was unquestionably aware, and which, in my view, constitutes the true structural foundation of the mandrake as a dramatic mechanism, the psychoactive and consequently magical properties of the plant. As a psychoactive and magical agent, the mandrake inebriates, produces hallucinations, visions, weakens the grip of the ego, and so on. To put the matter in most general terms, the mandrake constitutes first and foremost a special sort of disruption. It upsets categories, making fluid, sets in motion what before was fixed. It interrupts a course of events, a train of thought and identity, not by the introduction of an alternative course, another thought, a new identity, but, to borrow Nietzsche's imagery, by melting them down and causing the frozen river of being to flow again in its becoming. It is by virtue of this property that the mandrake as an agent, a body of subterranean mutability, serves as the structural pivot of Machiavelli's play, constitutes the fertile surface along which identity functions take shape in keeping with the network of intersecting desires that play upon it. Since it is with respect to a particular matrix of desire that the effect of the mandrake comes into play, let us reflect briefly on those passions which initially organize Machiavelli's characters. First, we have the desire for emotional and sexual gratification, which motivates Calimico to return from Paris to Florence, his home city, burning with desire for Lucrezia, in which Sostrata, Lucrezia's mother, wishes for her daughter. Then we have the desire for progeny, concerning which Nicia proclaims his willingness to, quote, do anything in order to realize, which is ascribed to but not professed by Lucrezia, and which Sostrata too wishes for her daughter. Next, we have the desire for economic stability, both personal and institutional, which motivates Friar Timoteo's participation in the conspiracy that ensues. Finally, we have a case of what I will describe as empathetic desire. While Ligurio, a quote, parasite, enjoys Calimico's hospitality and is promised a, quote, good sum of money to assist in the plot to seduce Lucrezia, he contests the supposition that it is these benefits which motivate him. Quote, even if I didn't expect to get something out of this for myself, he says, I want this to work just as much as you do. As Machiavelli supplies no grounds to doubt this claim, I am inclined to take the character at his word. Thus is Calimico's desire with its specific intensity also Ligurio's. Ligurio has no special desire unto himself, but serves as the empathetic surface upon which other desires play. Explicitly those of Calimico, but in effect those of all the other characters as well. It is in this role, as the conduit of desire, that Ligurio serves as the agent of the mandrake. In their initial configuration, the characters as they are presented to us as determinate personas cannot be integrated into a functioning affective ensemble. It is the work of the mandrake to decouple the fixed persona from the desires which seek expression through it and to reduce the character to its affective elements, to a place below its individuation, to an extended plane of differential libidinal forces. Once this is accomplished, it is Ligurio as the agent of the mandrake who reconfigures these elements through a series of transformations, visionary appearances as it were, which give rise to the concretely integrated socio-affective structures. That is, the structures in which each libidinal property at play is coupled with circumstances in which it can realize itself, and by extension, with the individuated personas through which these circumstances can come to pass. Thus does Calimico, the young Florentine merchant, become first the medical doctor who, quote, prescribes the mandrake, then the young lout of the marketplace compelled to spend the night with Lucrezia, and so to suffer its poisonous effects, and finally himself once again in Lucrezia's confidence, while yet he is to maintain a separate public persona with respect to Nicia. Likewise, does Nicia transform from husband to cuckold, Friar to Matteo from pedantic clergyman to sin provocateur to a mask of Calimico, and then himself once again, albeit in corrupted form. And finally, does beautiful and wise and virtuous Lucrezia, whose body is the object but never the direct subject of desire throughout the play, in the end become herself an active libidinal agent in a socio-affective matrix brought to bear via the disassociative effect of the mandrake. Under the shifting surface of identities, of personas which each character assumes, swarm the multiplicity of desires configured and reconfigured by Ligorio until each can be integrated into a libidinal ensemble entailing the activity of all. Calimico and Lucrezia emerge from the process with the freedom to pursue their intersecting sexual interests. Nicia shall have his child, Friar to Matteo his funding, Sostrata her progeny, and Ligorio his dinner. Now, to speak more generally, the comic effect of the play has a twofold derivation. It involves first the dissociative property of the mandrake, the manner in which it separates, distinguishes an assemblage of desires from the modalities of expression. Libidinal forces, thus liquidated or rendered fluid, redistribute themselves and condensate into an integrated configuration of intersecting trajectories. In the end, each seed of desire, each character finds its satisfaction, however seemingly objectionable its form, within the framework which has taken shape. Thus, to the extent that the mandrake, its delirium, is the mechanism of transitive identity and the affective matrices to which it gives way, does it constitute here at least the substance of the comic effect. Laughter emerges as its symptom. To elaborate further on the ligature obtaining between desire, the mandrake, and the emergence of the comic, it is necessary first to situate the mandrake within the philosophical milieu appropriate to it. In view of Anthony Farrell's arguments concerning Machiavelli's humoral theory of statecraft, to which I'll return below, I propose to interpret the mandrake in relation to the notion of Hayyim, or prime matter. In the first book of the Physics, Aristotle states with his characteristic terseness, quote, "What desires the form is matter as the female desires the male," unquote. Matter is construed as a desiring thing, a thing which desires absolutely, and, as Avicenna later described it, incessantly. Hence emerges the long tradition of representing the subversion of order which matter embodies as a rapacious woman. Maimonides, for example, states that, quote, "Matter ever divests itself of one form and divests itself in another, so that it is compared to a married harlot. She is never without form, thus is she married. Nonetheless, she always, as it were, seeks another man." The representation of matter as rapacious and disordered also accounts for its equally long association with madness, with the, quote, "disintegration of personality," which accompanies immersion in the primal chaos. In prime matter, then, in the absoluteness and relentlessness of its desire, in its subversion of order, its delirious and perpetual flight of appearance, which nonetheless constitutes the very presupposition of the ordered coming to be arranged upon its surface, we find the mandrake equivalent. In order that this reading serve to elucidate the theoretical structure of Machiavelli's comedy and ultimately the comic structure of his political theory, it is necessary to digress further so as to situate helomorphism with respect to its medical adaptation in the work of Hippocrates and Galen. In his On Generation and Corruption, Aristotle builds upon the helomorphism of the physics to account for compound yet homoamorous bodies by way of a theory of elemental mixtures, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm respectively, the four humors. On the basis of this theory of organic composition, health was construed as a balance of humors. More broadly, health could be conceived as the perpetuation of humoral mixture, circulation, and transformation of a body coming to be, just as the same was said of Aristotle's elements with respect to prime matter. As such, the body now stands in for the latter. Therefore, humoral balance or equilibrium is not a stasis but a perpetual flux, a circumstance of constant mutation which has the body as its substratum. which therefore gives form to the body as a configuration of humoral forces. In contrast, illness was construed as humoral imbalance, the predominance of one or another humor, which therefore impeded the flux of all, the liquid formation of the body and its coming to be. Accordingly, was healing regarded as a restorative process, a return to equilibrium predicated on, quote, a therapy that expelled excess humor. The humoral purgation was a function assigned to the spleen, as, for example, Maimonides maintains in his medical aphorisms. In this role, was the spleen regarded as the seat of laughter, as, for instance, Yehuda Levi put the matter in his Kuzari, quote, the spleen is called laughing because it is its nature to clean both blood and spirit from unclean and obscuring matter. If they are pure, cheerfulness and laughing arise. Laughter in this construction corresponds not to the act of purgation. It is not, in other words, akin to the tragic catharsis of which Aristotle speaks in his Poetics, but to the state which follows it. Laughter is a symptom of humoral flux. Hence, humor is a genre of the comic. A standard account of the comedy of humors will speak of the humorous character, who, due to a preponderance of one or another of the constitutive fluids, suffers from a distorted personality, and by way of the comic plot, discharges his excess, becoming, as it were, dehumored. While this may indeed be the case in many instances, I believe that a more comprehensive account is possible. If we consider the character, or more broadly the individual, as always already integrated into an ensemble of social relations, which, as Marx proposed in his thesis on Feuerbach, constitute human essence, the distribution of humor is ever a social one. We can speak no longer of humored character, but only of a humored ensemble. If then health is to be conceived along humoral lines, its meaning will be constructed in terms of a flux of social affect independent of the individuals which realize but do not reify it. Accordingly, humor, or more precisely the form of laughter which accompanies this flux, will involve the free passage of libidinal forces through a plurality of intersecting forms. As Deleuze explains, humor favors multiplicity. It entails the dismissal of height and depth to the advantage of the nonsense of the surface. It celebrates the pure event, the flow of singularities, independent of the individuals which embody or actualize them. Humor, in other words, represents the fluid interplay of intensities, their assumption and shedding of individual forms, the perpetual articulation and rearticulation of a unidimensional substance. Having now interpreted the position of the mandrake and its function within the framework of Machiavelli's play, in terms of the theory of humors, the conception of laughter, to which it gave birth, and ultimately in the notion that humor involves the fluid passage of effective intensities over the surface of the human ensemble, the social matrix, it is possible to consider the relation of the master's comic writings to his political and historical work. As I noted above, the theory of humors as a set of medical principles, as a means of conceiving human physiology, its constitution, and ultimately to interfere with it therapeutically, gives way to a social theory of personality types. In his groundbreaking work, The Machiavellian Cosmos, Anthony Perel demonstrates with great erudition the application of this idea to the interplay of broader socioeconomic and cultural interests, which is pervasive throughout the Machiavellian corpus. Rather than repeating here in an infinitely inferior fashion Perel's work, I cited some length the fundamental conclusion at which he arrives so far as it is relevant to the present study. Quote, for Machiavelli, each social humor validly exists in a social group. If one group determines to eliminate the other, civic freedom will be lost to oppression and domination. The humoral conflict, if it is to produce healthy results, must preserve the identity of all the contestants and must give due satisfaction to all. Otherwise, the body politic as a whole will suffer. One group requires the active opposition of the other as a condition for its own existence and vitality. On this reading, the humors of pre-modern medical science come when transposed onto the body politic, the differential structure of interests, the plurality of socio-political desires at play within the human ensemble. Accordingly, social pathology is construed as an imbalance of interests in which one predominates, preventing the satisfaction of others, and thus throwing off the equilibrium of the body politic as a whole, including those individuals or groups purportedly favored within the framework of the state of affairs. Humoral disequilibrium now entails not the distorted personality, but as it were the distorted public. The task of statecraft, attending to the health of the body politic, then involves configuring this matrix of desires such that the particular form in which each affective trajectory is expressed is such that it intersects with, can be realized with respect to the others. It involves the perpetuation of socio-affective flux. Conceived in this way, it follows that the body politic operating along Machiavellian principles, the state in which socio-political desire is so configured that it circulates freely, that it exists in perpetual flux, is in fact a laughing body. It is here that we discover, first, the link between Machiavelli's political work and his comic writings, and second, the specific significance of the mandrake as a political structure. As I explained above, the initial configuration of constitutive desires in La Mandrangola is such that they run parallel to one another, do not intersect, and cannot be cojoined. Assemblages of desire have yet to be distinguished from the modalities of their expression. The consequence, a reification of identity. The same takes place with respect to the body politic when social interests become fixated on one or another form of their satisfaction. What is objectionable, what makes for ineffective political practice, is the inability or unwillingness to distinguish policy, for example, from the aim which it seeks to embody, when the former is incompatible with other aims at play in the political spectrum. Fixating on it results in a winner-take-all approach to political activity, which amounts as Perel notes to the tacit approval of domination and oppression, not freedom, not democracy. Thus, even the side which ultimately prevails does so within the framework of a corrupted body politic, within which it may not be able to thrive in the future. It may itself be overwhelmed by the superior force of another competing party. Therefore, what is required is a mechanism by means of which to decouple interests, desires, affects, and so on from their expression and set them at play within the framework of the political environment, to dissolve political identities, reduce them to the forces whence they arise, and thereby allow for their recondensation in affective configurations in which each force, each desire is situated within an objective framework that conduces to its satisfaction. In La Mandrangola, this mechanism is the mandrake and the dissociative delirium which it spreads, the sequence of appearances which it organizes, the laughter which it produces. Because in speaking of the effect of the mandrake, it distinguishes it from the particular manner in which it is wielded so as to organize the chaos it generates, and therefore from Gregorio as a character, as the one who wields the mandrake, it is no longer possible to do as others have done and interpret this element of the play as an allegorical reference to the Machiavellian virtue of adaptability. This quality, as it appears in Machiavelli's work, is a property of political leadership, a property of the prince. The effect of the mandrake necessarily takes place with respect to the populace as a whole. I would like to suggest that following Althusser's Gramsci-inspired interpretation of Machiavelli, the mandrake amounts to a sort of primitive political accumulation that precedes the establishment of any space or institutions onto which hegemony can be projected. As such, the mandrake constitutes, as Althusser puts it elsewhere, an ideology in general. Without falling into an extensive discursus on Althusser's approach to ideology, let us briefly consider the central thesis of his essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. Quote, "The category of the subject is only constitutive of all ideology insofar as all ideology has the function which defines it of constituting concrete individuals as subjects. It is in this sense that ideology in general constitutes a pre-individual matrix of forces within the framework of which the individuated subject takes form. Thus, as Althusser himself notes, quote, at the risk of being taken for a neo-Aristotelian, does ideology in general constitute a sort of prime matter, a material substratum lending itself to specification in many senses, taking shape in a plenum of material practices, hegemonic procedures, and, to speak in those terms employed throughout this essay, configurations of desire. The laughter of the body politic in this sense emerges as a feature of the process wherein concrete ideologies, fixations of political desire, policy fetishism, as it were, are perpetually disintegrated and submerged in the flux of ideology in general, their social substratum. It amounts to a lateral progression from appearance to appearance, a reduction of ineffective political sense to an effective political nonsense, which supplies the circumstances for the fluid condensation and recondensation of competing interests, also into intersecting socio-libidinal matrices, which amount in total to the institution of the comic republic. Thank you.
Question for Mr. Rothman. questions from someone.
So thank you for your paper. I thought it was very rich, and there's actually so much in there that it's hard for me to sort out. But I was wondering if maybe you could expand a little bit about how Machiavelli takes the comic and applies it to the prince, or how you see the comic as influencing his political ideas.
So I think basically in the prince, at least, what he I would say is in most general terms, what he's discussing is being able to to adapt sort of social structures in order to meet political goals. So if you have a variety of different interests represented in your body politic, in the case of Machiavelli, he would have been talking about the popular assembly versus, say, various forms of the aristocracy in Florence, for example. So each of them have competing interests, and the question is, how do you satisfy all of them and therefore create a stable political environment? So the way that he envisions this happening is basically by finding ways that these interests can be made to intersect so that everyone ends up getting what they want, although not necessarily in the form that they initially thought that they will be getting it in. So in terms of the comic, I believe that what the mandrake functions as is a question of, well, how do you get to the point where you can even separate the actual aims or interests from the forms in which they come to be conceived by the people who are expressing those interests. So because we tend to think in terms of particular forms without thinking in terms of the desires that give rise to them. So I believe that what the mandrake is functioning as is a way of reducing that, or separating those two things, and sort of reducing socio-political desire to its original forces, and therefore sort of allowing for a redistribution. But precisely that political redistribution from sort of one form of desire to another form of desire is exactly what is happening between the characters that take on different personas over the course of the story of in La Mandrangola, such that that is the content of what makes it a comical thing. So structurally, what we end up looking at is a comic structure governing both. Is that?
Yeah, thank you. No, it's
I actually have a question. The part about from the first book of the physics, I think you said it was, with desire and matter, was really interesting to me. And I was thinking about, in terms of Deleuze, I mean, it's typical that, one, he doesn't really cite people, and also there are these philosophers that are sort of, that he's engaging with, but maybe not explicitly always. And so I was kind of just thinking to myself briefly, places where Aristotle comes up, and I was thinking about in 1,000 Plateaus, I think, is where the section on holomorphism and hexaity and things come up. Not that they're necessarily explicitly engaged with Aristotle, but I was just curious if, if you could say a little more about that connection between matter as desiring in the first book of the physics, and maybe where that comes up explicitly in Deleuze, or if maybe it is only in 1,000 Plateaus.
Yeah, I don't know.
And just maybe how that would relate to his ontology of desire, Deleuze's.
I don't know that I can point to a particular source where he's engaging directly with Aristotle, but I think that at least in sort of my understanding of, so how does he understand humor to operate? It's basically the transition from form to form. This is what makes it. This is what the comic is. It's not just wordplay, but it's the idea that you can sort of have a universal passage across forms. So that's why in what is it? Coldness and I forget the title. The one with on Desaad and
Coldness and Cruelty.
yes, thank you. where he talks about the idea of contrasting humor from irony, where irony is a vertical structure. It involves the idea of individuated subjectivities in relation to representations of ideal forms and things like that. So I guess what I would suggest is that in the same way that the sort of material substratum that Aristotle is discussing in relation to the passage of forms over it would function in the same way as what Deleuze is suggesting in terms of a purely horizontal construction of ontology. I don't know.
No, thank you.
Questions? I have a follow-up question with your discussion with Matthew. When you say form, so when Aristotle says form, it might be different than the forms that you're talking about. So I was a little bit confused about the terminology. So when you say the comic moves from or desire or moves from form to form, what idea of form are you using? Because the Aristotelian form is going to be different, right, from the Platonic form, which is going to be different from the form that you're using.
Of course. The way that I imagine it is if you conceive of the way that I've sort of constructed the idea of prime matter as a desiring thing, as opposed to some sort of absolute ontological unit or something like that, being or whatever. So it is a sort of a complex of various desires, and the question is, desires always take on particular structures. I want something, I don't just want in general. But the fact that I want something is predicated on my capacity to want in general. So the way that I'm conceiving form in this sense is a particular arrangement of desires that then, as an arrangement, can be described in individual terms. So that would be how I'm thinking of it. So not form in the Platonic or Aristotelian sense, but form in the sense of a giving shape to a certain set of desires.
So would it be the content of the desires, or would it be the object of the desires, or would it be kind of the flow of those desires?
I have to think about that one.
Okay.
Is the truth.
We can talk about it later.
It seems to me with Aristotle, when matter and form comes together, it makes the matter a this, a this particular thing. But I think correct me if I'm, not understanding, your idea of form meeting the social body, if you will, or whatever, is it's never a set thing. It's always fluid, and, like you said, bringing in Deleuze and stuff like that. It always has infinite lines of variation and always changes. It can at any one time be something, but it's never something stable. Where form to me with Aristotle always makes matter, a this. It's potentially is something.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One, just on the notion of humor, because your paper seemed to flip back and forth between our notion of humor as tied to the comic, and then that old sense of humor as choleric and sanguine, and all that stuff. And I wasn't quite sure if you could just say more how you see them functioning in Machiavelli. It just wasn't.
Okay, so.
Or if you see a distinction there to be made.
So the theory of humors as choleric and phlegmatic and all these things, that gives rise to a specific notion of humor as a comic structure. So that's where I was talking about the purgative role of there's many different accounts of the same process, where it, by the purgative effect of the spleen, which sort of cleans the circulation of fluids in the body, then laughter emerges, and laughter in this sense is seen as a type of equilibrium. so akin to maybe Spinoza's Hilaritas or something like that. I distinguish the theory of humors from humor as a comic structure, but what I'm suggesting is that the concept of humor that ends up coming out of this theory of humors can be described quite interestingly as sort of this sort of passage of forms, a circulation of fluids, a constant type of becoming. So I see them as interrelated, but I'm not saying that humor as a comic structure is equivalent to humors as a physiological principle.
Okay, because at one point you said humor is a genre of the comic, but what you're saying almost sounds the opposite, that given all these humors, the comic emerges sort of spleen as one type of humor among the others. Would that be?
Well, in this sense, in this particular quote that I was using, he's not referring to a splenetic humor. He's referring to the role of the spleen in opening up the circulation of all the other humors. So I don't think that I'm suggesting that the humor is the spleen or the splenetic humor, but rather that it's something which comes out as a result of an activity of the spleen.
Okay, no, that's helpful. My second question goes back to Deleuze, because as you said, for him, humor is masochistic and irony is ironic, and irony goes to the level of principles and humor goes to the level of consequences, but they're both sort of against the law. They're ways of transgressing the law or going beyond the law. So I wonder if you see from that point of view, if Machiavelli is masochistic, in the sense that for him, masochism is against the law in the sense that you get punished for transgressing, but it's that very punishment that gives you the pleasure. And that's what makes masochism. It takes the punishment and turns it against, it's no longer a punishment, it's actually a thing that gives me pleasure. So there's a kind of comic subversion of the law in Masoch there. And I wonder if you see something, I don't know how, but similar in Machiavelli's analyses.
So first, to kind of like flesh out what Deleuze is doing with humor in relation to the masochistic, I think at least there, or at least my understanding of it, is his question is, in what form does masochism subvert the law? In what form does sadism subvert the law? The form in which masochism subverts the law is by projecting it perfectly. So a perfect observance of the law will result in absurd, humorous results. And the specific way that it does it is by saying, okay, I fully accept the idea that if I do something wrong, I am punished. So all I have to do is, there's an equation between punishment and doing something wrong. So if I receive my punishment, then I am freed to do the thing wrong, right? So it just, all it does is just reverse the equivalence, which still follows the structure of the law to the T. So I guess I would suggest in that particular sense of what masochism is, that Machiavelli could be considered masochistic to the extent that what we're really talking about is a manipulation of material practices within a political environment to satisfy all the different interests that may be at play, whether or not they sort of conventionally conform to the supposed principle underlying the legal structure. So I don't think that Machiavelli would be necessarily promoting that we be whipped by others. I can't think of a source for that, but in terms of the relationship between law and satisfaction, I think that there is a certain masochistic form to it.